Hi, folks. Welcome to All Good Research Comes to an End with myself, Janet Rockney, and Natalie. So we're here to just kind of talk you through a couple of things to think about in that beginning stages. And as I mentioned, we will share slides and the link to the recording once we're finished. So if you do have to head out or if you want to share the slides with a coworker later on, that's completely acceptable.
So our plan today is to go through tools and resources that can help you in the last stages of your project, go over some roles and responsibilities when you're finalizing your research, assess the completeness of your work, and then finally tie up some loose ends before closing your project.
So we have a quick poll. For those of you who are here, we just have two quick questions. These are what they look like. I'm just going to find the poll. There it is. And launch it. So they're anonymous like all Zoom polls. So if you have a minute, you can let us know if you're in that end project phase, or if you're just sort of thinking ahead, which is also great. And then once you get through that first question, you can go through the second question. What's your role in research? I'll just give it another 15 seconds or so. If you're doing multiple things while taking the workshop, don't feel like you have to stop everything and kind of get the poll. It's just nice to hear who's here. Okay, I'm going to wrap things up. So it looks like more of you are not currently in this moment, but you're thinking ahead, which is great. A couple of you do have projects wrapping up, which is awesome. And if you have specific questions, we're always happy to hear about them. And everybody here is a grad student today. Awesome. Time of year, probably, but that's great. Thanks for playing along.
All right. So first and foremost, it's important to complete any requirements you've agreed to when you're nearing that end of your project. And documents that outline those requirements can be useful resources to revisit when you are nearing the end of a project. Those documents could include consent forms for human participants, agreements signed with research partners or publishers. They could be data sharing agreements where you've agreed to share the results of your data in a variety of forms with participants or more widely, maybe send copies of data or reports to community partners, report back to partners on next steps, etc. Some of these agreements may be captured in things like consent forms where participants consented to specific terms and agreements. They may have said, yes, you can make this interview publicly accessible online, or please keep my interview restricted for 5 years before making it available, or use a pseudonym and redact my real name from these interviews. So making sure you follow through on those terms is important when you're wrapping up a project. If your project team wrote a DMP in the early stages of the project, now is a great time to refer back to it. You will likely have set plans for sharing, access, and long-term preservation during this discussion and that writing of the DMP. While things can change over time, it is helpful to review your intentions and consider how best to achieve them where possible. Of course, you might not have completed a DMP in the early stages of your research. Maybe, one wasn't needed at that time, but even the questions involved in a DMP may still be useful to ensure that you're tying up all those loose ends at that stage. Oh, sorry, a data management plan. So even just a blank data management plan template can be a useful thing to go over. There might also be some tools that are helpful in making the final steps of your project more efficient. If you're planning to be moving a lot of files from point A to point B towards the end of your project, moving them from a local directory on your computer, for example, to an external hard drive, or maybe you're moving them from your kind of active draft project directory to a final directory where only your final works are going to be. You might look into a tool like TerraCopy. This is a tool that helps you perform a copy or cut and paste process on your files and kind of manages that process so that you can kind of see what's been transferred properly. So it'll prompt you to select how you want to perform that copy and paste action. You can do it as you normally would, or you can decide to do it through Terracopy, and it'll check for file integrity throughout that copying process. So you'll get notified if a file didn't copy over properly, if it changed in that process in any way. It generates logs as well. So if something did go wrong, or you're not sure if you had selected everything when you made that copy process, you can go back and check that. So it can just help giving you a little more confidence in knowing all your files have been moved over properly when you've got a lot of data that's moving at the end of a project. You might also look into deduplication tools to help you clean up your files and delete extra copies of things that you may no longer need. A tool like ALLDUP, that's ALLDUP, all one word, that can be used to flag exact file matches or even near matches that maybe have the same file title, and then allow you to review those matches and decide what needs to be kept. And then you can run a deletion process on all of the files that you've identified as being duplicates or near duplicates that you don't need to keep. A batch renaming tool might be helpful if you are working with naming conventions and maybe you haven't been applying them regularly as you've been doing your work. If you need to go through a large directory of files and they all need to start with the same acronym, or every space needs to be replaced with a hyphen or an underscore, maybe you need to have every file name start with a lowercase letter. Tools like bulk rename utility can help you automate that process and apply those kind of conventions to a full directory of files. Some tools can also help you with some of that final quality assurance and cleanup work to make sure that things are consistent and well structured. OpenRefine is a tool like that. It kind of looks like a spreadsheet, but it works on your web browser. It's still locally hosted data. It's not on the online or accessible to others. But it can help you perform some of that kind of quality assurance work more effectively. It can help you structure data consistently. It can quickly scan for inconsistencies like typos in a spreadsheet cell where a value should be the same for every cell. It can find those little typos, or even like a change in case where maybe you spelt something all lowercase one case, but you should have had that uppercase character at the beginning. We do have a previously recorded OpenRefine session on the library's YouTube channel, and it goes into a lot more detail about that tool if that might be something you're interested in looking into for cleaning up your data. There's also MDQC, which stands for Metadata Quality Check. That's another tool that might be useful, especially if you're working with larger groups of files that need to be fairly consistent in how they are formatted. So it'll let you set some rules around file properties, and then it'll run those rules against a group of files that you point it to and flag anything that doesn't conform to those rules. So for example, if you're digitizing a lot of documents or photos and they all need to be formatted as JPEGs, they all need to be scanned at a specific resolution, let's say 600 ppi, you can set those rules and run a report on your files, and it'll tell you what doesn't conform to that set of rules. So it will tell you, hey, we found a PNG file and you said these should all be JPEGs. We found a lower resolution and you'd asked for a 600 ppi resolution. Generally, if at the end stage of your project, you're coming across a lot of repetitive manual tasks that need to be done to wrap things up, it's worth doing a quick Google search and just seeing whether there's software available that can make that process a little less painful. Maybe it can automate things to some extent. If you are looking for tools to run specifically on a U of M computer or device, I will just caution you to loop IST into that process. It is helpful to do that for a few reasons. If the tool isn't free, maybe UM has a license for it. Maybe they've already looked into this tool and they found a better option. Maybe there's some concern around cybersecurity if the tool isn't actively maintained by the vendor and updated. You might also need IST at some point in the installation process, so it's better to ask ahead and make that smoother. Better to ask for permission than forgiveness. If you're installing content on UM systems, you want to be able to be sure that you are doing that safely with the most up-to-date information. So looping IST into that process is the best way to do that. It's also good to look over any tools license. Some have free versions, but are only meant to be used in that free version in this very specific context, like for personal use and not necessarily for work purposes. And it's also useful overall to keep a list of tools that you've been using throughout your research to refer back to. It might help you with future projects if you can't remember the name of the project or the tool a few years later. Maybe some are worth referencing in descriptions of your project so that other people might reuse your data later and know what tools might be helpful to help them render the files and analyze them. In terms of roles and responsibilities, throughout the project lifecycle, there will be a lot of different roles and responsibilities, and depending on whether you're mostly working on your own or as part of a team, some of these roles might largely fall on you, or they might be shared across multiple people. You or your team have a responsibility to know your data, not only what it is, but where is it? Is it in one central location? Is it all on OneDrive? Who has access to that space? Who's been editing in that space? Do you have files in other additional spaces? Maybe you kept copies directly on your desktop just to work in those files more actively, or you have, flash drives in a desk that have a copy that you created at some point. Did different members of your team do the same, keep their own kind of copies when they were actively working in the files? And are all of their changes consolidated in one place? When you close a project, now's the time to wrangle those files and make sure you know what is the authoritative, up-to-date final version, and make sure that that version remains unchanged once it's been finalized. You should also clean your data. So when you go through it all, you might need to deduplicate copies of the same files, consolidate some information, delete transitory documents that don't have long-term value or aren't needed after the project is over. Files that you do intend to keep should also be cleaned up. You might need to anonymize sensitive information, make a few corrections, quality check your data. This could include resolving inconsistencies in terminology or formatting. Maybe you promise to securely destroy specific files, so you may need to ensure a hard drive is sent out for confidential shredding or destruction. Hitting the delete key on your computer or cleaning out your recycling bin doesn't truly delete files. So if you've made a promise to completely wipe certain files from your system at the end of a project, it is important to make sure you follow through with that. You might need to reformat a file, turn a Word doc into a PDF, or turn an Excel workbook into a CSV. You also have a responsibility to keep people informed. If you're going to start deleting files, moving them, making changes, and other members of the team might be actively working in those files or are planning to refer back to those files, they should know where to locate them or when they should stop editing them. If you've applied specific naming conventions or want to ensure a specific word is always spelled consistently, members of your research team should be aware of that so they can do the same, and that reduces the time you'll need to clean up files towards the end and resolve all those kind of different styles that people might have applied to different files. Keep research participants informed as well where applicable. So if you intend to make your files publicly available in a repository, this shouldn't come as a surprise to research participants. They should have been informed as part of the consent form process that would happen. They should know where the files will end up when the project is over and what will be made accessible to who, when, and in what ways. If you are committing others to certain things, also make sure those people are informed or you've secured the right permissions. If you've committed to making your data openly available through a specific repository or donating your records to an archive, does that repository support data like what you are planning to deposit? Does the archive know you're planning to donate records, and have they signed off on that? No one should be surprised to find out they've been committed to certain things when you're closing your project. You should also ensure that your expectations have been met. If you've promised research participants that their name would be redacted from final documents that would be deposited, make sure their names are fully redacted. If you promised a publisher that you would provide a DOI for your research data, make sure a DOI is minted when you deposit. And last, you do have a responsibility to think about your data long-term. Is the intention to keep your data accessible long-term? And what is long-term for you? Is it 5 years after you deposit? Is it 10? Is it forever? Is the data going to remain accessible after you leave the institution, after you graduate, after you retire, or you move to another workplace? Are there any obstacles to that? So for example, do you need continued access to your email in order to manage your data long term? And will you be able to maintain that access after you graduate or you retire? If you're aiming to have your data be accessible forever, who's managing that data in 200 years? Who would answer questions users might have about it? Who will keep it accessible if file formats need to be updated to the latest formats or remain accessible? If your data outlives you, or even if it just outlives your time at this institution, it is good to think about who might take over that long-term management for your data, where that's applicable before you close your project.
Okay, my turn. So thinking about assessing completeness, whether you are as done as you think you are. So build in some time at this end stage for some quality assurance. Similar to what Natalie has mentioned already, checking that all the files that you expect to be part of a project are there, and that any hyperlinks in those files are functional, the information is up to date, important terms are defined. We're talking about all of this stuff in relation to someone else looking at this work at a later date, but also for yourself. It's really easy once you leave that active stage of research to forget, what was that acronym that I was using every day for 3 years, and then I stopped using it and moved on to something else, right? So thinking about things that need to be anonymized or deleted, and have they been carefully redacted and disposed of as needed. Remember that this also applies to the storage devices you might be using. So securely wiping and disposing of things like USBs, external hard drives, etc. A little bit easy to lose track of all of those things. If you're depositing your data, so if that's part of your mandate from a funder or a publisher, or if you're choosing to participate in that open data sharing process, check that your deposit is actually useful, that it has those definitions, that it has some descriptions, so that someone who's coming in cold can understand the data that you've shared with them. If your files are meant to be downloadable, can you do that? Do they display properly, or did something get reformatted unintentionally when you uploaded the files from the repository? For something like a digital exhibit, you might also want to check whether files display fairly consistently in different settings. So if you have visual objects, maybe check them on a phone and a computer and in a couple of different browsers like Chrome, Safari, or Firefox. Talking about metadata. So metadata is data about data. And it's usually like things like tags, titles, authors, that kind of thing. So this can be really important because metadata can outlive the data it describes. So if someone can no longer access or view your data, there should still be detailed metadata for them to learn about the data that you've stored there. So I might not be able to play the video that you've posted because MP4s are no longer the standard at some point, but I can tell what the visuals are about, how long that video is, who is involved, those kinds of things. In ensuring the completeness of your project, consider whether your metadata aligns with community or discipline standards. So if you're posting to a repository, those things will be listed somewhere. Does it provide contextual information about the data? Is it well described? And do you use keywords to ensure others can find your information when they search for it? So keywords are really one of the only ways to locate information other than using a link directly, right? So if we're, for example, publishing something in a journal and then linking to our supplemental files or our full data set, is usually a DOI that does that connector. But there's also ways to look at data that doesn't have anything to do with the publication, or that they might find your data before they find the publication. So in those cases, you really want to focus on using some nice, clean tags that people can figure out, is this a sociology project? Are there is this a survey? Are there interviews? Those kinds of terms, right? So if you're making your data and its metadata available to others, consider the terms of use and access and make sure that those concepts are clear. So can anyone use the data that you've shared? Can they download it from an online repository, or can they only look at it in that platform? Do they have to ask you as the owner for permission? And do they have to include a specific attribution like a Creative Commons license or a citation when using the work? So these are things that generally when you're putting something into a repository, you have to answer these kinds of questions. But it's also helpful to, if you're really sort of shutting down a project, maybe you don't want to be connected to getting permissions, and maybe you just want to open it up because you're not worried anymore about how people are using things because things have gone really well. Something like that. Again, remember to take in your ethical and legal responsibilities into consideration when you're making any changes specifically for terms of access and use, but also just generally all through the process. If you have gone through ethics and told them what you're going to do, you need a pretty good reason to change that, and they will want to know about it. So we've mentioned DOIs a number of times, and if you're not familiar, you probably have used DOIs in the past, especially if you're reading lots of literature. There's DOIs in journal publications all the time now. DOI stands for Digital Object Identifier, and it's the kind of industry standard stable URL. Most repositories will generate one of these automatically as part of their publishing process. So making sure you have a DOI if you are depositing information is pretty important, or some kind of stable URL. So if you have been through the thesis program process at University of Manitoba and you've had to post your thesis, you'll get a stable URI. It's not a DOI, but it's sort of the same idea. Once you've posted your work into MSpace, and that can be used in your CVs or posted to ORCID so that people know that that's your work and that you can kind of track how that work is getting used. So publishers will often require a DOI if you're doing that kind of linking from a journal article. It helps to ensure your work is consistently cited because it is a DOI generates a citation, so it kind of tracks who's the author, where does it live, when was it published, those kinds of citation style pieces of information. It also gives more credibility to your work if someone's reading your article about the data and then is able to use the DOI to access that work. That helps them assess the completeness of your work by reviewing it more thoroughly and possibly reproducing the results. So that's one of the original reasons for sharing data, was for transparency and reproducibility purposes coming out of the sciences. It's also quite, it's kind of taken off in terms of, so if you're getting funding from a government or something like that, they want to be able to share that work as widely as possible, and the data itself is just as important as a publication based on that data. All of those kinds of things are wrapped up in this data sharing kind of component. Okay, so while we're on this page, there's a link in a couple of slides, but if you're a details or a checklist person, there are a few offboarding checklists out there today that are a pretty close match to what we've gone through already. And I have one more slide to kind of wrap things up, but I'll just link in the chat to one of these kind of checklists. This one's from Harvard Biomedical. And it's hosted in the data repository Open Science. So if that's kind of how your brain works, can be a nice way to get through this kind of work and assess that completeness of closing out your project. We didn't show it to you earlier because it is a little overwhelming to see it in a couple of pages, just sort of ding, 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 ding. But they're really kind of similar to what we've already talked about today. Okay, so there are probably a couple of loose ends. that we want to just make sure you've considered. They might not be obvious to wrapping up, but we think it's a really good time to consider these kinds of activities. So the first one we've got is updating orchids. Let me know if you're not familiar with what an orchid is, but it's a research profile essentially that is you can post things like where you did your postdoc and where you're doing your master's degree, where your employment is coming from, who's what publications you've done, any kind of granting. So it's sort of a built-out CV that's easy to find. People often will put them in their email signatures, that kind of thing. It's also a good time to connect your CV with whatever this project is that you're wrapping up, and make sure you've got some nice little links and citations and maybe some stats about how the work is getting used. So it's something that nobody really likes to do, and it's easy to forget. I always put this sort of stuff off, but it's a good time when you're in that wrap up mode to make sure that this project has made it to your profiles and your CV as well. Remember that if you have data sets or other ancillary publications, even like posters, that kind of stuff, you can add those to something like an ORCID profile, especially if you're like, as we found out in the poll, most of you are grad students. So you kind of want as much as possible to show what sort of academic work you're doing. And it can be a little harder to keep track of that kind of thing. And so ORCID is a really nice place to kind of boost your profile so that future employers, future programs can see what you're up to. Keeping contact information up to date. We've mentioned this a number of times. It's really, really important. And it's something that both Natalie and I come across fairly frequently that someone has forgotten to do. So it's really important for the principal investigator of a project, but it's helpful for every person connected to the research to keep your information current. So in platforms like Dataverse, which is one of our repositories for data, you can change your contact information in your profile. So if you move from the University of Manitoba to the University of Alberta, there's Dataverse in both places. You just change your contact information and you can continue working. Consider moments for doing this kind of work, such as graduating, changing programs, changing jobs, and then retirement. So any kind of major career transition is a good time to like, what do I still need to be connected to that I might not have thought of automatically? What am I going to lose when I change my institutional email? And do I need to kind of get ahead of that? Because it's always harder to do it after the fact than before. So some places will allow an unaffiliated address. So if you're working in programs like Dataverse or Data Management Planning Assistant, you can use like a Gmail address. Sometimes you can't. And so just even knowing like, okay, I have to change these couple of contact pieces once I end up in the new place, then I'll keep doing that, right? And also sharing. So if you're on a research team and you're the one who's leaving, the PI might not be like, hey, before you go, remember to share your new contact information, but it's a really nice thing to be able to do for them as well, to say, you know, I'm moving on to Alberta, but here's how to get hold of me if anything comes up in a couple of years that is related to this project. Consent forms. We've talked about consent forms a number of times. Again, this is going to be connected to human related research, but that's quite common in all varieties of research. So we want to mention it. So they're often housed separately from your de-identified data, which means they're really easy to lose track of. So because we often will do digital consent now, or you would have like a stack of papers of consent forms, they're almost always disconnected from the rest of your project work, right? They're in a separate folder. There maybe only one person has access to them, or they're in a locked closet in someone's office. So remembering to take care of them at the end of a project is really critical. So depending on existing agreements and responsibilities, you may be required to keep them for a certain time frame or destroy them at some point. So if you're working on, say, like a Health Canada trial, generally their years are 15. When you're working with University of Manitoba Ethics, their kind of default, if you don't have any other time frame connected, is 7 years, kind of like your taxes. So it can be just a good moment to kind of check in, make sure you know where they are, and make a note for a couple of years from now to do whatever you have to do as that final process, right? Some consent forms, and Natalie mentioned this earlier, allow participants to set different terms than others. So some may allow an interviewer to be made accessible their data right away. Others might ask for it to be restricted for 10 years. So keeping track of individual terms of consent is important if that's part of your process in the beginning, particularly long term. And that is something that we're seeing more and more, that there's kind of granular choices to be made within the consent because people are sharing data more frequently, more openly. For participants to feel comfortable doing that, we're kind of making a few more options available, which of course is a little bit more work for the researchers, but worth it in the long run, I think. So data that needs to remain accessible long term may be managed by someone other than you at some point. For example, a repository or an archive who may need to confirm those terms of consent. So this is a good time to have that conversation with whoever you're passing off the work to so that they understand fully what their responsibilities are. And then lastly, on consent forms, some research teams will, and I see this fairly often, I don't know how often you see it, Natalie, but will upload a sample blank consent form with the rest of their data, allowing the readers to see kind of what their consent process looked like. It's a useful part of understanding the context of the project and then also what they can expect to see out of that shared data later on. And it's really nice to sort of, if you consent forms are really complicated to build and annoying, and if you can like find some examples, it's really helpful. And I know like our ethics board also has some templates and things like that. Thinking long term. So we've kind of mentioned this a number of times. It's really important, especially if you're at a career transition point. So you're preparing to finish your PhD, you're wrapping up a postdoc, you're a few years from retirement. Those are moments to make sure that you've got your projects kind of packaged well, you know what you have to do before you leave finally, and the people who need to know where stuff is are in the loop. You can keep a document with forthcoming deadlines or add them to a digital calendar. I have things in my Outlook for like multiple years away, which feels kind of nutty, but it's really helpful. And I'm not going to lose it like I will lose a piece of paper, right? Again, especially important if you are the principal investigator, but any transitional career moment that you're anticipating is a useful time to just kind of check what you're connected to and make sure that you're being as responsible of a researcher as you can be. And then the very last thing that we want you to consider is to make some notes for next time. So I know that this feels like there's a lot of stuff to do in the wrap up phase, but really during that whole process, you can be thinking about like what worked, what didn't, pain points, new ideas to try. So if you are finding yourself doing lots of data file naming, renaming files, maybe you can reiterate the next time to your team, let's stay on top of this, right? Or if you're finding that your files are just absolutely everywhere in multiple formats, multiple files, try and think about like what kind of processes can I use to keep them corralled so that I don't have to spend days and reach out to 5 different people to make sure that I know where everything is. So it is really easy to just move on, and especially as researchers, we've often like kind of already started off on a new project, on down a new path, maybe with a new team. But you've learned a lot of lessons along this this path, this project that you're finishing up, and it's a great time to capture them. You can think about things like updating standard templates, or even just keeping some notes for yourself for the next time you get going on a project.
So some additional resources that we've referred to and that are good to kind of keep in mind throughout this process as we wrap this up include sessions that the libraries offers on different topics related to research data and digital projects. So you can sign up for upcoming sessions on managing your research data management tools at and writing a data management plan, which are all sessions that are coming up in November. The library's YouTube channel also has previously recorded versions of some of those sessions as well, if those dates don't work for you. It's also where you'll find a recording of this session sometime after the session, usually a few days or maybe a couple of weeks, but we'll update you on all that. It also has previously recorded sessions on Open Refine that we talked about that might be of interest, and a session on how to minimize the risk of data loss if you're thinking about long-term file management. You could also look into those offboarding checklists that Janet talked about, like the ones from the University of Wisconsin-Madison or Harvard, also linked on this slide and in the chat. It can be useful to use those checklists just to kind of keep track of what needs to be done at the end of the project. So yeah, those are some good resources to look into when you're closing off a project.
Okay, so that's our content for today. We would love it if you could spend a minute to give us some feedback. Natalie just posted Natalie posted that link to just me. Some feedback to the session. It's our first time running this one, and we're really curious to hear kind of what you expected, what was missing, if this was useful for you. I know a lot of you are sort of in that preparing for the future phase, but still kind of what you were looking for would be really helpful to hear. Our contact information is here. So I forgot to mention this at the very beginning, but my job is around research data management. I do lots of data management planning kind of projects, talking about data storage. And Natalie does data curation. So she does a lot of that wrap up work and preservation kind of stuff. Is there anything you want to add to your daily life, Natalie?
Yeah, like when we were talking about the long term, if you want to have those conversations too, feel free to reach out anytime. Like we can talk about how precarious digital data can sometimes be and how you can maybe make that a little less so.